In the spring of 1923, groundskeepers renovating St. Michael's Cemetery in Charleston, South Carolina made a discovery that city officials would immediately classify as too disturbing for public knowledge. While excavating drainage systems beneath the oldest section of the graveyard, workers noticed something unusual about 9 graves clustered near an ancient magnolia tree. The headstones, all dating between 1851 and 1855, belonged to some of Charleston's most prominent plantation owners and merchants, men whose families had built empires on rice and cotton and human bondage. But it was what the workers found when they opened those coffins that made the city's elite demand immediate silence. Every wooden lid bore deep scratch marks on the interior surface, gouges made by fingernails, 10 fingernails per coffin, clawing desperately at wood that would never yield, and the bodies, preserved by Charleston's humid soil and the particular chemistry of terror, lay twisted in positions that told a story no official record had ever documented. These men had not died peacefully in their beds. They had been buried alive, fully conscious, experiencing hours of suffocating horror before death finally came. And beneath the magnolia tree, wrapped in oilcloth and sealed in a metal box, the workers found a leather journal written in precise, educated handwriting. A journal that began with a single sentence that explained everything. "My name is Solomon Fairfax, and this is the account of how I became both physician and executioner to 9 men who believed themselves beyond the reach of justice." Before we descend into the darkness of what Solomon Fairfax did over those 4 years in Charleston, and before we try to answer the question that has haunted this story for a century, whether his actions were justice or simply another form of evil, we need you to join our community of people who refuse to let these stories stay buried. Hit that subscribe button, ring the notification bell, and tell us in the comments what state you're watching from. Because what you're about to hear is going to challenge everything you thought you understood about revenge, morality, and the limits of human patience. Now let me take you back to where this all began. To a March morning in 1851 when Solomon Fairfax's life ended and something much darker was born in its place. Charleston in the 1850s existed in a kind of fever dream of wealth and cruelty, where white-collar mansions looked out over the Cooper River and fortunes were calculated not in dollars but in human beings owned. The city's aristocracy moved through their days convinced that the system supporting their luxury was not just economically necessary but morally ordained. A natural hierarchy that placed them at the apex and everyone else, particularly the enslaved people who generated their wealth, somewhere far below. The medical community that served this elite was small and tightly connected, physicians who understood that their primary obligation was not to healing but to maintaining the comfort and confidence of families who could afford to pay handsomely for discretion and innovation in treatment. Dr. Cornelius Hathaway had established his practice on Meeting Street in 1845. Quickly building a reputation among Charleston's upper class for his willingness to experiment with exotic remedies and his possession of a truly exceptional medical assistant. Solomon Fairfax was not like the field slaves who worked the rice plantations that surrounded Charleston, bodies broken by labor that killed most men before they reached 40. Solomon stood tall with intelligent, watchful eyes and hands that moved with the precision of someone who had spent years mastering difficult skills. He had been educated, unusually for an enslaved person in South Carolina, learning to read and write and calculate alongside the children of his first master, a man who had believed briefly and against the advice of all his peers that educated slaves were more valuable than ignorant ones. But Solomon's real education had come from his grandmother, a woman who had been brought from West Africa as a child and who carried with her knowledge of plants and healing that had been passed down through generations of women who served as the primary medical practitioners in their communities. She had taught Solomon which leaves could reduce fever, which roots could ease pain, which bark could be brewed into compounds that would stop infections from spreading. And she had taught him something else, though she had never spoken it directly. She had taught him that the same knowledge that healed could also harm, that the difference between medicine and poison was often nothing more than dosage and intent. Solomon had lived for 32 years on the Pemberton plantation, 15 miles outside Charleston, where he had married a woman named Celia and raised 3 children in the quarters that plantation owners permitted their slaves to maintain as a concession to the reality that completely breaking the human spirit made for less productive labor. The Pembertons had allowed this arrangement because Solomon's healing skills proved invaluable during the frequent outbreaks of fever and flux that could devastate a plantation's workforce overnight, and because Celia was an exceptional seamstress whose work was sold in Charleston shops under the Pemberton name. Their eldest son Marcus, 8 years old, had inherited his father's quick mind and his grandmother's gift for understanding how living things worked. Their middle child Samuel, 6 years old, possessed a gentleness that seemed almost miraculous in a world built on violence. Their daughter Grace, 4 years old, had her mother's spirit and her father's unwillingness to accept injustice without question. Everything ended on March 14, 1851, when Edmund Pemberton's gambling debts finally exceeded his ability to defer payment, and his creditors demanded immediate liquidation of assets. The sale was scheduled for the Charleston slave market, and it was to include Solomon's wife and children, who would be separated and sent to different plantations across South Carolina and Georgia, a practice so common that plantation owners had stopped even pretending to see anything troubling about it. Solomon had begged. He had offered to work additional years without compensation, to hire himself out to other plantations during off-seasons, to do anything that might keep his family intact. Edmund Pemberton had listened with the expression of a man weighing a minor business decision, and then he had refused. The sale would proceed as planned. The debt would be satisfied, and Solomon would learn, as all enslaved people eventually learned, that nothing he wanted mattered in the slightest when set against the convenience of white men. The morning of the auction arrived gray and threatening, with storm clouds building over the Ashley River as if the sky itself understood what was about to happen. Solomon held his family through the night before, memorizing the sound of their breathing and the weight of their bodies against his, knowing that he would carry these memories for however many years he had left to live. Celia maintained her composure with the strength she had always shown, focusing her energy on preparing their children for separation while refusing to let them see her own breaking heart. Marcus tried to be brave in the way 8-year-olds do, asking practical questions about where they might be taken and whether they would be allowed to write letters, not understanding that enslaved people had no right to correspondence and that the separation about to occur was designed to be permanent and absolute. But the true horror began not at the auction itself, but during the journey there. The wagon carrying Solomon's family and 6 other families being sold struck a rut in the rain-soaked road, tilting sharply and throwing several people against the wooden sides. Celia fell hard, her head striking a rock embedded in the roadside, blood immediately flowing from a wound that Solomon recognized as dangerous. He fought against his shackled hands, screaming for the slave traders to stop, to get help, to do something. The traders looked at Celia, looked at the blood, performed a quick calculation about whether delaying the journey and paying for medical treatment would yield more profit than simply continuing on, and made their decision. They left her there by the roadside, unconscious and bleeding, and forced the wagon to continue toward Charleston. Solomon's screams brought punishment, blows from the traders' clubs that left him barely conscious himself by the time they reached the city. At the auction, still dizzy from the beating and the horror of what had just happened, he watched as his children were sold to separate buyers. Marcus went to a rice planter from Georgetown who specialized in using children for dangerous work in alligator-infested irrigation systems. Samuel was purchased by a cotton farmer whose reputation for working slaves to death was known throughout the region. Grace, too young for field work, was sold to a family in Savannah and led away crying for her mother, who was either dead or dying on a roadside 15 miles away. Through all of this, Solomon maintained enough control to stay silent, knowing that any display of resistance would make things worse for whatever remained of his family. But inside, something that had been human was transforming into something else, something patient and calculating and utterly without mercy. Dr. Hathaway purchased Solomon that afternoon, paying a premium price for a slave with documented medical skills. The doctor needed an assistant who could prepare complex compounds and handle delicate procedures as his arthritis made precise work increasingly difficult. He was unaware of what had happened that morning, unaware that the man he was bringing into his practice was no longer the skilled healer whose reputation had attracted his interest. Solomon was led away from the auction block to begin his new life, and as he left, he looked back once at the place where his family had been scattered like seeds in a fire. In that moment, looking at the platform where human beings were sold like livestock, Solomon made a decision that would define the next 4 years of his life. He would wait, he would learn, and he would make every man responsible for this pay a price equal to what they had taken from him. His first weeks at Dr. Hathaway's practice passed in a fog of routine and observation. Solomon performed his duties with the same competence he had always shown, mixing medications and preparing treatment rooms and assisting with patient examinations. But beneath the surface, he was conducting an entirely different kind of study. He was learning the patterns of Charleston's medical community, the families who comprised Dr. Hathaway's clientele, the casual conversations that revealed who had been present at slave auctions and who profited from the trade in human beings. He listened to wealthy patients discuss their recent purchases, their strategies for breaking resistant slaves, their methods for maximizing profit from human labor. And he remembered every name, every face, every detail that might prove useful. Dr. Hathaway, a widower with no children who had come to rely heavily on Solomon's assistance, began allowing him to handle certain patients independently when dealing with chronic conditions that required regular monitoring. This growing trust was exactly what Solomon needed for the plan that was taking shape in his mind. Charleston's wealthy elite, initially viewing Solomon with the typical mixture of indifference and condescension they showed all enslaved people, gradually came to request him specifically, praising his gentle manner and his apparent intuitive understanding of their ailments. They had no idea that Solomon was studying them the way a hunter studies prey, learning their weaknesses and their schedules and their connections to the system that had destroyed his family. Through careful research conducted over months, Solomon identified 9 men who had direct involvement in or profited significantly from the auction that scattered his children. Some had been present that day, bidding on human cargo with a detached interest of men purchasing horses. Others had provided financial backing for the slave trading operation, lending money to dealers who specialized in separating families because separated slaves sold for higher individual prices. A few owned the plantations where slaves from that auction had been sent, including the rice plantation where Marcus had been taken and the cotton farm that had purchased Samuel. These 9 men became Solomon's targets, and he began compiling detailed information about each one: their medical conditions, their treatment schedules, their business relationships, their habits and routines. Everything he would need to execute what he was planning. The education Solomon needed to transform from healer to killer came from Dr. Hathaway's extensive medical library, which contained numerous texts on pharmaceutical compounds and exotic plant toxins. One book in particular, a treatise on South American botanical specimens, described a vine whose sap could induce complete muscular paralysis while leaving the victim's consciousness entirely intact. The affected person would appear dead to anyone lacking specialized medical knowledge, showing no detectable pulse or breathing, but would remain fully aware of everything happening around them for several hours before the compound's effects became truly fatal. Solomon spent months locating and cultivating this plant, eventually finding specimens in the greenhouse of Professor Nathaniel Crenshaw, who taught natural sciences at the College of Charleston and was delighted to share his botanical collection with someone who showed genuine interest in exotic species. Solomon's experiments with laboratory animals allowed him to perfect the dosage required to achieve the exact effect he wanted. Too little would cause only temporary weakness. Too much would result in immediate death. But the correct amount would create a state indistinguishable from death to 1850s physicians, while preserving the victim's consciousness long enough for them to be pronounced dead, prepared for burial, placed in a coffin, and interred in the ground. Long enough for them to experience the same helpless terror that Solomon's children had felt as they were torn from everything they knew. Long enough for them to understand, in those final hours, what it meant to be completely powerless while something terrible happened to you. The selection of his first victim required careful consideration of opportunity and symbolism. Colonel Reginald Fitzpatrick was a rice planter who had not only attended the auction but had loudly joked about the breeding potential of the children being sold, treating the destruction of families as casual entertainment. Fitzpatrick suffered from chronic gout and visited Dr. Hathaway monthly for treatments. His predictable schedule, his trust in Solomon's medical abilities, and his habit of coming to appointments alone made him the ideal first target. But Solomon forced himself to wait through the summer and fall of 1851, knowing that patience would be essential to avoiding suspicion and ensuring that all 9 men received what they deserved. On December 15, 1851, Colonel Fitzpatrick arrived for his regular appointment complaining of increased gout pain. Dr. Hathaway was occupied with another patient and instructed Solomon to begin the consultation and prepare Fitzpatrick's usual medication. This routine delegation of responsibility provided exactly the opportunity Solomon had been waiting for. As he prepared the colonel's treatment, he added precisely measured drops of his paralytic compound, his hands steady and his face showing nothing but professional concern. Fitzpatrick consumed the medication without hesitation, having no reason to suspect the man he had watched serve him for months. As the toxin began taking effect and Fitzpatrick started feeling weak, Solomon pulled a chair close and spoke quietly. "Colonel Fitzpatrick, I want you to know that my name is Solomon Fairfax. On March 14th of this year, You attended the auction where my wife and 3 children were sold. You laughed when the auctioneer described my daughter as good breeding stock. You made jokes about separating slave families. Do you remember that day?" Fitzpatrick's eyes, already beginning to glaze as the paralysis advanced, showed recognition and then growing horror as he realized what was happening. He tried to speak, to call for help, but found that his voice was gone along with his ability to move. Solomon continued in that same quiet, professional tone. "The medicine I gave you has paralyzed every muscle in your body, but your mind is completely clay. You can hear every word. You can feel everything. In about an hour, Dr. Hathaway will examine you and pronounce you dead from heart failure, which everyone knows you've been at risk for. Your body will be prepared for burial, and tomorrow evening you'll be placed in your coffin and interred at St. Michael's Cemetery. But you won't actually die for several hours after burial. You'll be fully conscious as they lower your coffin into the ground. You'll hear the dirt hitting the wood, and you'll have plenty of time, Colonel, to think about what you did to my children and to understand what real terror feels like." When Dr. Hathaway entered the treatment room 5 minutes later, he found Solomon standing respectfully beside what appeared to be Colonel Fitzpatrick's corpse, his expression showing appropriate sadness. The doctor's examination confirmed Solomon's report. No detectable pulse, no breathing, and given Fitzpatrick's heart condition, the cause of death seemed obvious and unremarkable. Within hours, the body had been removed to the colonel's mansion, where arrangements were made for a funeral befitting one of Charleston's most respected citizens. Solomon attended the burial, standing in the section reserved for slaves while Colonel Fitzpatrick's coffin was lowered into St. Michael's Cemetery. As the first shovelfuls of earth struck the wooden lid, Solomon wondered if Fitzpatrick was still conscious, still experiencing the suffocating darkness. The thought brought him no pleasure, only a cold sense that the scales were beginning to balance. The months following Fitzpatrick's burial passed with agonizing slowness as Solomon waited to see if his method had aroused suspicion. Charleston's social circles discussed the colonel's death with the expected expressions of grief, but no questions were raised about the circumstances. Dr. Hathaway mentioned the case to other physicians as an example of how suddenly heart failure could strike, and Solomon's reputation remained untarnished. This success gave him confidence to proceed, but it also forced him to confront the psychological cost of what he had done. Despite absolute certainty about the justice of his cause, watching a man die in terror had affected him more than expected. He couldn't sleep for weeks, not from guilt but from imagining in vivid detail what Fitzpatrick had experienced in those hours underground. His second victim, Judge Marcus Calverton, had provided legal justification for slave family separations in court cases throughout South Carolina, arguing that such practices were essential for economic efficiency and social order. The judge suffered from severe migraines that brought him to Dr. Hathaway's practice with increasing frequency. In April of 1852, while preparing the judge's medication, Solomon administered a dose of his compound that was slightly stronger than he had used on Fitzpatrick. The result was a more complete paralysis that set in faster than expected, so complete that even Dr. Hathaway noticed something unusual about the body's condition. "Strange," the doctor murmured as he examined Judge Calverton. "The muscle rigidity seems more pronounced than typical for stroke victims." For several terrifying minutes, Solomon feared his plan was about to be exposed. But Dr. Hathaway's medical knowledge, while advanced for its time, lacked the specific expertise needed to recognize the effects of an exotic toxin he had never encountered. He concluded that the unusual symptoms were simply the result of a particularly severe stroke. Judge Calverton's funeral drew even more prominent citizens than Fitzpatrick's, and Solomon watched from his designated place as another coffin was lowered into the ground, this one containing a man who was experiencing exactly what Solomon had promised. 3 rows away, Colonel Fitzpatrick lay in his own grave, the 2 men now united in having learned too late that the people they had treated as property were capable of sophisticated and patient revenge. But Solomon's success was attracting attention of a different kind. Thomas Grimby, a journalist for the Charleston Mercury, had begun noticing what he called the permanent death phenomenon, a series of sudden fatalities among Charleston's elite that seemed statistically unlikely. Grimby started keeping detailed records of who died, when, and under what circumstances, looking for patterns that might connect these deaths. This development meant Solomon would need to accelerate his timeline, moving faster than he had originally planned, accepting greater risks to complete his mission before Grimby's investigation revealed the truth. His third target, Captain William Dandridge, on shipping vessels that transported slaves between Charleston and markets throughout the South, personally supervising the loading of human cargo with the same attention he gave valuable cotton shipments. Unlike Solomon's previous victims who visited Dr. Hathaway's office regularly, Dandridge was generally healthy and rarely sought medical attention. Solomon would need to create an opportunity rather than wait for one. That opportunity came through Charleston's network of enslaved kitchen workers who shared information about upcoming social events. Solomon learned that Dandridge was hosting a dinner party for prominent shipping merchants, and through connections with slaves who worked in food preparation, he arranged to assist with serving the meal. The evening of the dinner party, May 20th, 1852, brought together 12 of Charleston's most influential maritime traders in Dandridge's mansion on East Bay Street. Solomon moved through the dining room with practiced invisibility, refilling glasses and clearing plates while listening to conversations that revealed the casual brutality underlying Charleston's prosperity. These men discussed human beings with the same detached interest they showed for commodity prices, viewing families as divisible assets to be separated and sold for maximum profit. Solomon's opportunity came during the serving of dessert, an elaborate brandy soap cake that required individual preparation. Working in Dandridge's kitchen, he carefully added his compound to the captain's portion, ensuring the toxin would be absorbed through the alcohol-saturated dessert. Dandridge consumed it with obvious enjoyment, complimenting the cook and requesting the recipe. Within 30 minutes, he began feeling dizzy, excused himself from the table claiming he needed fresh air, and made his way to his study where he collapsed into his leather chair as the paralysis reached full effect. But Dandridge's death in front of 12 witnesses created exactly the kind of attention Solomon had hoped to avoid. Dr. Samuel Pettigrew, one of the dinner guests, examined the body while others looked on with growing alarm. "This is most peculiar," Pettigrew announced. "Captain Dandridge appears to have suffered some form of seizure, but the symptoms don't match apoplexy or heart failure. The muscle rigidity is quite pronounced, almost as if he had been poisoned." That word, spoken in front of Charleston's elite, sent shock through the room and marked the beginning of the end for Solomon's carefully constructed campaign. By morning, news of the suspicious death had spread throughout Charleston's social circles, and Thomas Grimby had arrived at Dandridge's mansion before dawn, interviewing servants and guests. His investigation revealed that Solomon had been present at the dinner party, marking the first time any individual could be connected to multiple recent deaths. The journalist's notes, discovered decades later, showed he had begun to suspect a pattern long before authorities took the death seriously. But Charleston's elite were not ready to believe that an enslaved man could be sophisticated enough to plan and execute such methodical revenge. Solomon understood that time was running out. 6 of his 9 intended victims remained alive, and the increasing scrutiny made it unlikely he could eliminate them using his established methods. Desperation and the knowledge that his window was closing led him to make a decision that would end his mission but ensure that his story would never be forgotten. He would target multiple victims simultaneously using a method that would leave no doubt about what he had done and why. His research had identified a private meeting scheduled for June 15, 1852, when 6 of Charleston's most prominent slave traders would gather at an office building on Meeting Street to finalize contracts for expanding their operations. The meeting would take place in the evening after normal business hours, providing Solomon with an opportunity to trap all 6 men in one location. His plan was both brilliant and desperate. He would introduce his paralytic compound into the building's gas lighting system, ensuring that everyone present would be exposed to lethal doses within minutes of the lamps being lit. Waking at night over 2 weeks, Solomon used his access to medical supplies and his knowledge of chemistry to prepare a concentrated form of his toxin that could be vaporized when exposed to the heat of burning gas. He gained access to the building's central gas distribution room and injected his compound into the main supply line feeding the conference room, where the meeting would occur. On the evening of June 15th, he positioned himself across the street, watching as the 6 men arrived and the office windows began glowing with lamplight. Within 30 minutes, the building fell silent. Solomon waited another hour to ensure the paralysis had taken complete effect before using a key he had obtained to enter through the rear door. The scene in the conference room was exactly as he had planned. 6 men sat around a mahogany table, frozen in the positions they had occupied when the toxin struck. Their eyes, the only part of their bodies still capable of movement, tracked Solomon as he moved around the room. He approached each man individually, speaking in that same calm voice he had used with all his victims. He identified himself and explained exactly what was happening, describing in clinical detail how they would remain conscious throughout their burial and the hours of suffocation that would follow. He wanted them to understand not just that they were dying, but why, and what their deaths represented. He wanted them to know that the system they had profited from had created the man who was killing them, that their casual cruelty had transformed a healer into an executioner. But as Solomon prepared to leave the building and allow the victims to be discovered in the morning, he heard footsteps in the corridor. Thomas Grimby, the journalist who had been investigating the deaths, had been following leads that pointed to this meeting, and he arrived just in time to find Solomon standing over 6 apparently dead bodies. The confrontation that followed would be documented in Grimby's own journal, discovered decades later. "So it's true," Grimby said quietly. "Someone has been systematically murdering Charleston's elite, and you're responsible." Solomon made no attempt to deny what was obvious. "They destroyed my family," he said simply. "They sold my children like cattle and left my wife to die by a roadside. This is justice, not murder." Grimby's response revealed the complexity of Charleston's racial dynamics even in the face of obvious crime. As a journalist, he was committed to exposing the truth. As a Southerner, he understood the brutal realities that had motivated Solomon's revenge. "Those men in there," Grimby said, gesturing toward the paralyzed victims. "They're still alive, aren't they? That's why their eyes are moving." Solomon nodded. "They'll experience exactly what my children felt when they were torn away from everything they knew. They'll have hours to think about what they did." The conversation that followed, recorded in Grimby's journal, showed a man wrestling with competing obligations. His duty to report a mass murderer, his understanding of the injustices that had created that murderer, his recognition that in any just society, the men Solomon had killed would face consequences for their participation in a system that treated human beings as property. The sound of approaching voices outside the building ended their confrontation. Other people were coming to investigate, either because they had been expected at the meeting or because someone had noticed unusual activity in the building. Both men realized that within minutes Solomon's fate would be sealed. Grimby offered him an escape route, pointing to a back stairway that led to an alley. But Solomon had already decided that his mission would end with his capture, not his flight. "I'm not running," he said with calm certainty. "Let them come. Let them discover what I've done. Maybe when this story spreads, people will understand that even slaves have limits to what they'll endure in silence." When Charleston's constables burst into the conference room, they found 6 prominent citizens sitting motionless around a table, apparently dead, and a slave who made no attempt to flee. Solomon offered a complete confession, explaining his methods and his motivations in detail that would later shock investigators and physicians throughout the South. His confession solved not only the evening's multiple deaths, but also the mysterious fatalities that had puzzled Charleston's medical community for over a year. The trial of Solomon Fairfax became one of the most controversial legal proceedings in Charleston's history, not because of doubt about his guilt but because of the moral questions his case raised. The prosecution presented it as simple murder. The defense, led by an appointed attorney named Benjamin Crawford who had not wanted the case, faced the impossible task of defending a client who had confessed to 9 murders while somehow arguing those murders were justified. Crawford's strategy focused on exposing the brutal realities of slavery that had created the conditions for such desperate revenge. The trial revealed details about Charleston's slave trade that had previously been hidden from public view. Testimony about family separations, the methods used to break resistant slaves, and the complete legal powerlessness of enslaved people created an uncomfortable mirror for a society that preferred to view slavery as benevolent. Solomon's detailed testimony about watching his family destroyed while being unable to intervene forced Charleston's elite to confront the human consequences of their economic system. Thomas Grimby's coverage of the trial for the Charleston Mercury created a sensation throughout the South. His articles, which included extensive excerpts from Solomon's journal and descriptions of the paralytic compound, were reprinted in newspapers from Virginia to Louisiana. The story of the slave who had turned medical knowledge into an instrument of revenge became a source of fascination and terror for slave owners throughout the region, many of whom began viewing their own educated slaves with new suspicion. The 6 men who had been paralyzed in the Meeting Street building survived their ordeal, though their experiences varied in horror depending on how long each remained conscious after their apparent death. Their courtroom testimony about lying paralyzed while funeral arrangements were discussed created visceral understanding of Solomon's revenge that legal arguments alone could not convey. Colonel Harrison Vance, one of the survivors, described hearing everything and feeling everything but being unable to move even an eyelid, trapped inside what appeared to be his own corpse while his wife wept over his body. The revelation that 3 earlier victims had been buried alive created public outcry that extended far beyond Charleston. Families throughout the South began questioning whether their deceased relatives had actually died naturally, demanding exhumations and post-mortem examinations that overwhelmed medical communities. The discovery of scratch marks inside Colonel Fitzpatrick's coffin when his grave was opened for examination confirmed Solomon's account in horrifying detail. Solomon remained calm throughout the proceedings, showing no remorse while expressing regret only that he had been unable to complete his mission against all 9 intended victims. His final statement to the court provided a summary of his motivations that would be quoted for generations. "I was trained to preserve life and ease suffering. But when this society destroyed my family while calling it legal and proper, I learned that the same knowledge used to heal can also ensure justice. I do not ask for mercy because no mercy was shown to my wife and children. I ask only that when you condemn me, you remember that I am not the one who created the system that makes such revenge necessary." The jury deliberated less than an hour before finding Solomon guilty and sentencing him to death by hanging. The verdict surprised no one given the magnitude of his crimes and the social necessity of maintaining order in a slaveholding society. But the speed of conviction did not resolve the moral questions his case had raised about slavery, justice, and the humanity of enslaved people. Solomon was executed on October 15, 1852, before a crowd of over 2,000 people. His final words from the gallows were recorded by Thomas Grimby and published in newspapers throughout the South. "I die knowing that 9 men experienced the terror my children felt when they were sold away from everything they loved. That knowledge makes my death worthwhile. But this system that creates such desperation will continue, and other families will suffer as mine did. When that happens, remember that even the most patient man has limits to what he will endure in silence." His body was buried in an unmarked grave outside Charleston, but his journal, which had been confiscated as evidence, disappeared from official records after the trial concluded. Thomas Grimby, who had been allowed to examine it during his coverage of the proceedings, had made extensive copies before returning the original. Years later, preparing his memoirs, Grimby decided to bury Solomon's journal beneath the magnolia tree in St. Michael's Cemetery, near the graves of the men Solomon had killed. His explanation, written in 1889, was remarkably honest. "I could not destroy the record of such methodical revenge, but I also could not allow it to inspire others to similar actions. Perhaps future generations will be better equipped to understand the terrible necessity that drove Solomon Fairfax to become both healer and killer." The discovery of that journal in 1923, during cemetery renovations that revealed scratch marks inside 9 coffins, provided final confirmation of a story that had passed into legend. The physical evidence proved that Grimby's account had been accurate in every detail. Charleston city government immediately classified the discovery as sensitive and sealed all related records, officially citing concerns about public safety, but actually protecting the reputations of prominent families whose ancestors had participated in the slave trade. The legacy of Solomon Fairfax extended far beyond Charleston. Throughout the antebellum South, slave owners became increasingly suspicious of educated slaves, particularly those with medical knowledge. New laws restricted slaves' access to books and scientific training as authorities recognized that education could transform the oppressed into dangerous opponents. The case influenced the development of forensic medicine in America, prompting research into methods for detecting unusual toxins that would prove valuable in future investigations. But perhaps the most significant impact was on the national debate about slavery itself. The revelation that even seemingly loyal slaves might harbor years of accumulated rage challenged fundamental assumptions about the institution's stability. If Solomon Fairfax, educated and trusted by his masters, could plan such methodical revenge, what did that say about the true feelings of millions of other enslaved people throughout the South? This question, which Solomon had wanted asked, contributed to growing recognition that the system built on human bondage was neither stable nor morally defensible. This story shows us that even in the darkest chapters of American history, individual acts of resistance could shake seemingly unshakable systems. Solomon Fairfax reminds us that justice delayed is not always justice denied, that sometimes it simply takes a different and more terrible form. The question his story asks, the question recorded in that journal buried beneath a magnolia tree and discovered 70 years later, is whether his actions were justified by the destruction of his family or whether his revenge was simply another form of evil creating more suffering in an already broken world. What do you think? Was Solomon Fairfax a man driven to desperate justice by an unjust system? Or was he a mass murderer whose victims' crimes, however terrible, did not justify being buried alive? Leave your thoughts in the comments, because this is the kind of question that has no easy answer. The kind that forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about revenge and morality and the limits of what any person should be expected to endure. If this story challenged you the way it challenged me, share it with someone who appreciates history that refuses to be sanitized. Subscribe so these stories continue to be told. And remember that the past is never truly buried. It's always waiting, just beneath the surface, for someone brave enough to dig.